The fence hummed, the night was quiet, and somewhere in the dark, a man who had never learned the word boundary was about to learn it in 10,000 volts. Callum Dreyer had built the fence himself. Every post, every rail, every inch of treated cedar that now stood 6 feet tall along the eastern edge of his property had been measured, dug, and secured by his own hands over 3 consecutive weekends in late September. He had done it legally, pulling the permit himself, confirming the property lines with a licensed surveyor, and even notifying his neighbors before the first shovel hit the ground. He had done everything right. He always did everything right. That was the problem with living next door to a man who believed that doing things right was a language only other people were required to speak. Gerald Foss had been the HOA president of Maplecrest Estates for 11 years. He wore that title the way a medieval lord wore a signet ring, constantly, conspicuously, and with the unspoken implication that it granted him jurisdiction over the lives of everyone within his visible range. He was 54 years old, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that looked permanently disappointed in whatever it was looking at. He drove a silver sedan that he washed every Sunday morning in the driveway, and he photographed his neighbors' lawns the way a detective photographs crime scenes. Callum had been on his radar since the day Callum moved in 3 years ago and declined to join the Welcome Committee, the Beautification Subcommittee, and the annual Spring Potluck Planning Group, all in the same conversation. The fence, however, was a new level of offense. It was not against code. It was not against HOA bylaws. Callum had read them twice before breaking ground just to be certain. It met the height requirement. It used an approved material. It sat precisely on the surveyed line. But it blocked Gerald Foss's unobstructed view of Callum's backyard, which Gerald had apparently been treating as an extension of his own sightline for years, and which he had on at least 4 occasions Callum knew of, physically entered without permission to retrieve a ball, inspect a tree branch that overhung the shared line, or simply to stand there and look around with his hands on his hips the way people do when they are reminding you that they can. The fence changed that, and Gerald did not accept change. The first incident happened 11 days after Callum finished the installation. Callum was in his kitchen making coffee at 6:40 in the morning when he glanced out the window and saw Gerald Foss standing in his backyard, not on his side of the fence, not peering over it. Inside the fence line, hands on his hips, looking at the garden bed along the back wall as if he were appraising real estate he intended to purchase. Callum set down his mug, walked out the back door and said with careful, deliberate calm, "Gerald, you're on my property." Gerald turned slowly. He did not look startled. He looked, if anything, mildly inconvenienced. "The latch on your gate was loose," he said. "I was checking on it." "The gate has a combination lock," Callum said. "I set it myself." Gerald looked at him with an expression that said very clearly that he did not consider this remark worth engaging with. "You should trim the arborvitae on the east side," he said. "They're going to crowd the fence line within 2 seasons." "Gerald," Callum said, "get off my property." Gerald left. He did not hurry. He walked to the gate, opened it with a motion that suggested he had done it before, and let it close behind him without looking back. Callum stood in the morning cold for a long moment, watching the space where Gerald had been. Then he went inside and pulled up his phone and began documenting. He wrote the date, the time, the approximate duration, a description of what he had observed and what had been said. He had learned in his previous life as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm that documentation was the difference between a complaint and a case. He emailed a copy to himself and saved a second copy to a cloud folder he had labeled with grim precision Foss. It happened again 9 days later. This time Callum did not catch Gerald in the act but found the latch on the gate disengaged when he knew he had locked it, and found a fresh partial boot print in the mud near the east garden bed. He photographed both. He sent Gerald a written notice via email and certified letter, informing him that the property was private, that any unauthorized entry constituted trespass under state law, and that Callum would not hesitate to involve local law enforcement if it occurred again. Gerald's response came 2 days later in the form of an HOA violation notice. Callum's fence, Gerald claimed in the official letterhead document, had been installed without proper review by the Architectural Committee. The notice cited a bylaw that Callum had not seen in either of the 2 readings he had done, a subclause added 18 months ago requiring any structure over 5 feet to receive committee pre-approval. The fine was $200, with an additional $50 per week for continued noncompliance. Callum read the notice twice. He took a photograph of it. He sat down at his kitchen table with his laptop, his HOA member portal login, and 3 hours of patience, and he found the meeting minutes from the month the subclause had been added. He found the vote. He found that the vote had been taken at a special session called with 48 hours notice rather than the required 72. He found that 2 of the 5 committee members had not been notified at all. The subclause was procedurally invalid. He documented all of it, had a real estate attorney friend review it over a phone call that evening, and sent a formal response to the HOA board within 48 hours, copying all 7 board members individually and attaching 43 pages of supporting documentation. The fine was dropped within a week. Gerald did not acknowledge it. The third entry, he began thinking of Gerald's violations in these terms, as entries in a ledger that would eventually require balancing, came on a Thursday evening in late October. Callum was working late in his home office on the second floor facing the street when something made him stop. A sound, perhaps, or the particular silence that follows a sound. He went to the back of the house, looked out the window, and saw Gerald Foss on top of the fence. Not climbing over, standing on the lower rail and gripping the upper edge, his head and shoulders above the fence line, looking into Callum's backyard with the calm deliberation of a man conducting an inspection. He stayed there for nearly 2 minutes, then he stepped down and walked back to his own yard. Callum did not go outside. He stood at the window very still, and felt something clarify inside him the way ice clarifies water, everything murky settling to the bottom, leaving the surface clean and cold and perfectly transparent. He had called the non-emergency police line twice. The responding officer on the first occasion had spoken with Gerald and returned to tell Callum that Gerald had described himself as checking on a property concern, and that absent any physical damage or direct threat, it was a civil matter. The officer had been sympathetic but honest. Trespass of this kind without escalation was nearly impossible to prosecute meaningfully. The second call had produced a similar result. The officer had been less sympathetic. The attorney had told him the same thing with more precision. A civil suit was possible. It would cost more than the outcome was worth, take between 8 and 18 months, and even if he won, the remedy would likely be a court order Gerald would violate and then deny. The law in this narrow corridor of petty aggression moved too slowly and struck too softly to be useful. Callum understood this. He was not a man who wasted energy on frustration. He was a man who solved problems, and so he began quietly and methodically to solve this one. He started with research. He spent 2 evenings reading about agricultural electric fencing, wildlife deterrent systems, and the legal landscape surrounding them. What he found was more permissive than he had expected. In his state, a property owner was legally entitled to install an electric fence on their own property for the purposes of deterrence, provided the fence was not installed with the intent to cause serious bodily harm, the voltage was within a range considered non-lethal, and the fence was clearly posted with warning signs. The standard agricultural voltage for livestock fencing was around 4,000 to 5,000 volts. The chargers commonly sold online went up to 10,000. All of them, at the amperage levels involved, typically less than 100 milliamps, were described by every source he found as painful but not dangerous to healthy adults. They were designed, after all, to stop animals far larger and more stubborn than Gerald Foss. He ordered the charger on a Friday. It arrived the following Tuesday. He ordered the warning signs at the same time, bright yellow, standardized, the universally recognized symbol for electric shock, and he mounted them on the fence in 3 locations before he connected a single wire. He documented the installation. He photographed the charger, the wiring route, the grounding rod, and each warning sign with its placement on the fence. He photographed the fence from Gerald's side of the property line to confirm the signs were clearly visible. He emailed the complete documentation to his attorney friend with a summary of his legal review. He received a reply the next morning. "This is defensible. Don't touch anyone with it directly and you're fine. Don't tell me anything else." He connected the fence on a Wednesday evening. It was a clean installation. The wire ran along the top rail of the cedar fence on ceramic insulators, 6 inches below the upper edge, positioned precisely where a person would grip the fence if they were climbing it or pulling themselves up to look over. The charger was housed in a weatherproof box mounted to the interior face of the fence post, locked and labeled. The grounding rod was buried 18 inches along the fence base. He tested it with a voltage meter, 11,200 volts. Within normal operational range, he adjusted the output dial to 10,000 and tested again. He went inside, he made dinner, he watched an hour of television. He went to bed at 10:30 and slept without difficulty, which was something he had not done easily in 3 weeks. He did not have to wait long. Gerald Foss came on a Saturday morning, 6 days after the installation. Callum knew because he had installed a small motion-activated camera on the exterior of the back of his house, angled to capture the fence line. He had not advertised it. He had checked it every morning as part of a routine that had become, without drama, simply part of his day. On this Saturday, he was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee at 7:15 when his phone buzzed with a motion alert. He opened the app he watched. Gerald appeared from the right edge of the frame, walking along the fence line in the deliberate, proprietary way that Callum had memorized. He was wearing a gray fleece jacket and carrying a coffee mug of his own. He reached the midpoint of the fence, the highest traffic section, the one Callum had noticed most often disturbed, and he stopped. He looked at the warning sign for a moment. Then he looked away from it in the manner of a man who has decided that things posted on other people's property do not apply to him. He reached up and grabbed the top rail of the fence. The sound that came out of Gerald Foss was not a scream. It was shorter and more surprised than a scream, a hard, involuntary bark of shock and pain, and he released the fence and stepped back so fast that he stumbled and went down on one knee in his own yard. His coffee mug hit the ground. Coffee spread in a dark fan across the November grass. Gerald knelt there for a moment, holding his hand against his chest, looking at the fence with an expression that Callum, watching on a 3-inch phone screen from his kitchen, could read with complete clarity. It was not anger yet. It was the pure, unfiltered shock of a man who had never, in 11 years of small dominions and quiet trespass, encountered a consequence. Then Gerald looked up at the camera. Callum had not tried to hide it. The knock came at 9:14 that same morning. Callum had been expecting it, not with anxiety, but with the focused readiness of someone who has prepared thoroughly for a meeting they know is coming. He had spent the intervening 2 hours reviewing his documentation folder, which now ran to 67 pages, and confirming one final time that everything was in order. When the knock came, hard and deliberate, he set down his coffee, straightened his shirt, and opened the front door. Gerald Foss stood on the porch with his right hand wrapped in a kitchen towel and an expression that had passed through shock and arrived at a destination somewhere between fury and the kind of cold certainty that belongs to men who are accustomed to winning. Behind him, visible at the end of the driveway, was a Maplecrest Estates police cruiser. The officer leaning against it was young, perhaps 27, and he had the cautious demeanor of someone who had arrived expecting to mediate and was not yet sure what he had walked into. "You electrified your fence," Gerald said. "Good morning, Gerald," Callum said. "You electrified the fence deliberately. You didn't tell anyone you're trying to injure people." "I posted 3 warning signs." Callum said, "Would you like to see the photographs?" Gerald stared at him. "I could have had a heart attack." "The system operates at 10,000 volts and under 100 milliamps, Callum said. "That is within the standard range for agricultural deterrent fencing. It is painful and disorienting, but it is not cardiologically dangerous to a healthy adult." "Are you saying you have a heart condition? If so, that would be relevant information for you to consult with your doctor about, not with me." "I'm going to have you cited," Gerald said. "I'm going to have that fence removed." "On what grounds?" Gerald took a step forward. "The HOA has authority over all exterior modifications." "The HOA's authority was litigated extensively in October," Callum said pleasantly. "The subclause you attempted to apply was procedurally invalid and the fine was withdrawn. The current bylaws do not prohibit electric fencing. I reviewed them. Would you like a copy of my review?" The officer had moved closer during this exchange. He was standing at the base of the porch steps now, listening. He had a careful face, the kind that absorbed information before forming conclusions. "Mr. he said, looking at Callum. "Dreyer, Callum Dreyer." "Mr. Dreyer, I'm Officer Trent Halsey. I received a complaint this morning regarding a fence installation on this property. Can you walk me through what you've got out back?" "Absolutely," Callum said. "Come in." He led Officer Halsey through the house to the back, Gerald following without invitation. In the backyard, Callum walked the officer through the installation with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed the tour, which in a sense he had. He pointed out the warning signs, explained the voltage and amperage, described the legal review he had done, and produced on his phone the email exchange with his attorney confirming the installation was within legal parameters. Officer Halsey looked at the fence. He looked at the warning signs. He looked at the documentation on Callum's phone for a long, careful moment. "Were you aware of the fence's electrical component, Mr. Foss?" he asked, turning. Gerald's expression shifted slightly. The signs were not prominent enough. "They meet the posting standards specified in State Agricultural Code," Callum said. "The dimensions, color, and placement are all compliant." "Mr. Dreyer," Officer Halsey said, "can I ask why you installed this?" "Yes," Callum said. He unlocked his phone, opened his documentation folder, and handed it to the officer. This is a record I've kept since August. It includes dates, times, photographs, and written descriptions of Mr. Foss entering my property without permission on multiple occasions. It includes 2 police reports from prior calls, I can give you the reference numbers, and a written trespass notice I sent certified mail in September. It includes the HOA fine he attempted to levy, the documentation of its procedural invalidity, and the formal withdrawal. It also includes this morning's camera footage, time-stamped, showing Mr. Foss approaching the fence, observing the warning sign, and then proceeding to grab the electrified rail. The silence that followed had a particular quality. It was the silence of a conversation whose trajectory had just changed completely and irreversibly. Officer Halsey scrolled through the folder slowly. Gerald stood very still. He watched the warning sign, the officer said. It was not quite a question. For approximately 4 seconds, Callum said, then he looked away from it and reached for the fence. Gerald said sharply, that is not what happened. The footage is time-stamped and unedited, Callum said. You're welcome to view it. Officer Halsey handed the phone back to Callum. He turned to Gerald with an expression that was professional and perfectly unreadable. Mr. Foss, I'm going to need you to come back to the cruiser with me for a few minutes. Gerald straightened. This man has created a public hazard. The fence is on private property, posted with legally compliant warnings and installed within documented legal parameters, Officer Halsey said. What I'm looking at right now is a record of repeated, documented trespass and a this morning incident in which you appear to have disregarded a visible warning. I need you to come to the cruiser. Gerald went. He did not look at Callum as he passed. Callum waited in the backyard. The November air was cold and still. A bird moved somewhere in the arborvitae along the east fence line. The fence hummed faintly in the quiet. 20 minutes later, Officer Halsey came back alone. Mr. Foss has been issued a formal trespass warning, he said. It's logged. If he enters your property again without your consent, it becomes a criminal matter, not civil. You'll receive a copy of the report by end of day. Callum nodded. I want to be candid with you, Officer Halsey said. The fence is legal, the documentation is thorough, but this is a neighborhood and whatever resolution comes from this, you're still going to be living next to that man. I know, Callum said. Is there anything else going on here I should know about? Callum considered the question carefully. The HOA board has a meeting scheduled for next Thursday, he said. I've requested time on the agenda. I have documentation of 7 procedural violations in HOA governance over the past 2 years, all involving Mr. Foss's unilateral decisions on matters that required full board votes. I intend to present it. Officer Halsey looked at him for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes that might, in a different context, have been respect. Good luck, he said. He left. Callum stood in his yard alone and listened to the quiet. Then he went inside, sat at his kitchen table, and opened his laptop to the document he had been preparing for the Thursday meeting. It was currently 41 pages. He thought it would probably reach 50 by the time he was done. He was not angry. He had not been angry in a long time. What he felt instead was something quieter and more durable, the particular steadiness of a person who has stopped waiting for someone else to establish the rules and has simply begun, with care and precision, to establish them himself. The Thursday board meeting was held in the community center on Birchwood Lane, a low-ceilinged room with fluorescent lighting and 8 metal folding chairs arranged in a loose horseshoe. 6 of the 7 board members were present. Gerald Foss sat at the head of the configuration with his jaw set and his hands flat on the table in front of him, a man bracing for impact while pretending he was not. His right hand, Callum noticed, was no longer wrapped. There was no visible mark. There would not be. The fence had left no permanent damage, only a lesson Gerald had spent 11 years ensuring no one ever had the mechanism to teach him. Callum sat across from him in one of the chairs set out for community members. He had a printed copy of his presentation for each board member which he distributed before sitting down. He had driven to the copy shop himself and paid for color printing because the photographic evidence reproduced better in color and he wanted it to be unambiguous. He spoke for 22 minutes. He did not raise his voice once. He presented the documented trespass history in chronological order, noting dates, times, and the official police reports. He presented the HOA fine incident, walking the board through the procedural invalidity of the subclause vote with the precision of someone who had been through parliamentary procedure enough times to find its rules instinctively. He presented 6 additional instances, 4 involving Gerald overriding board votes via email without a quorum, 1 involving a landscaping contract awarded to Gerald's brother-in-law's company without a competitive bidding process as required by bylaw, and 1 involving a $3,400 expenditure from HOA reserves that appeared in the accounts but not in any meeting record. He placed a copy of the state HOA governance statute on the table. He said, "I am not here to remove anyone from their position. I am here because the governance of this association has for some time been operating outside its own rules, and because I believe the members of this board individually may not have been aware of the full scope of what has been done in their name. I am giving you this information because you are entitled to it. What you do with it is your decision." He sat down. The room was quiet for a long time. Then Margaret Aldous, who had been on the board for 4 years and whom Callum had spoken with only once in passing, asked Gerald about the landscaping contract. Gerald said it had been handled through proper channels. Margaret asked him to produce the competitive bid documentation. Gerald said it was on file. Margaret asked him to produce it now. Gerald could not. What followed was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no raised voices, no overturned chairs, no moment of operatic confrontation. It was, instead, the slower and more permanent collapse that comes when an architecture of assumption meets documented reality and finds it has nothing to stand on. Gerald Foss, over the course of 90 minutes, found himself unable to answer 8 specific questions about HOA expenditures and procedures, each one put to him by a board member reading from Callum's printed document. He became by increments a smaller version of himself, the shoulders that had always been set wide and forward drawing inward, the voice that had always carried the particular authority of a man accustomed to being the loudest becoming quieter, and then quieter again. At the end of the meeting, the board voted to appoint an independent financial review of the past 3 years of HOA accounts. The vote was 5-1, Gerald casting the single dissent with the grim mechanical motion of a person who understands the count but cannot stop making the gesture. 3 weeks later, the financial review produced a finding of $11,200 in undocumented expenditures. The board referred the matter to the HOA's legal counsel. Gerald Foss resigned the presidency on a Tuesday morning via email, citing personal reasons, effective immediately. Callum read the email in his kitchen over coffee. He read it once. He did not feel triumphant. He felt instead the specific quiet of a person who has carried something heavy for a long time and has finally set it down, not in victory exactly, but in the simple relief of no longer carrying the weight. He went outside. The morning was cold, the sky the flat white of November holding still before it moved. He walked the perimeter of his fence, checking each post the way he had done every few weeks since the installation, pressing each one at the base to confirm it was still set true. The cedar had darkened slightly with the season. The warning signs were crisp and clear. The wire ran clean along the top rail. At the gate, he stopped. He looked at the combination lock, which was exactly as he had set it and had always been since the morning Gerald had somehow opened it and claimed it was loose. He had never determined how Gerald had done it. It did not matter now. He went back inside, he sat down, he opened his laptop. He deleted the folder labeled Foss. It had 67 pages, 43 attachments, camera footage covering 42 days, and a record of every small cruelty that a man with a title and no conscience had believed he could visit on a neighbor without cost. Callum selected it, moved it to the trash, and emptied the trash without hesitation. He did not need it anymore. The balance had been reached, not through force or spectacle, but through the slow, unglamorous discipline of a person who refused to become what was being done to him and who trusted, despite every reasonable temptation to doubt, that the truth, properly documented, could do its work without help from rage. Outside, the fence stood quiet in the morning. The wire hummed almost below the threshold of hearing, a low, clean frequency, patient and present, protecting the ground it was asked to protect. It had only ever needed to fire once.